So Lynette will be talking for about 30 to 40 minutes. And then we will open it up for Q&A. So without further ado, Lynette.
Okay. So I suppose we are ready to go. Where is this? Sorry. I'm back there. Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, the trigger doesn't seem to be working. Okay, so it's great to be here. So I'm going to talk about outsourcing repression. So this book is about how repression is conducted in China on an everyday basis, and how it contributes to this augmentation of everyday state power. So let me start with a quote from reading Lolita in Tehran. So the worst crime committed by totalitarian mindsets is that they force their citizens, including their victims, to become complicit in their crimes. Dancing with your jailer, participating in your own execution, that is an act of utmost brutality. So the theoretical puzzle that the book addresses is, how do you actually balance coerce compliance with minimizing backlash? So we know that repression often invites resistance and backlash, right? But for an autocratic government, the challenge is that how do you actually impose repression so that you can get compliance, but at the same time minimizing backlash? Is this fine balance between the two that is the puzzle of the book? So I used urbanization as the empirical context. So the book looks at state-led urbanization in China, which rose rapidly from the 90s, from 40% to 51% to 2011 to 66% in 2022. And urbanization in China is very much a state-led process, because it is the state that is actively acquiring land and taking land and converting land from agricultural usage to industrial, as well as for commercial usage. So it's very different from, let's say, more organic driven type of urbanization in many developing countries. So you would imagine with such rapid urbanization rates, you would get massive displacement in China. And yes, there has been a lot of displacement. So this is an underestimate. Millions of peasants have been displaced over the last few decades. But given the massive displacements, you would imagine you would see tremendous resistance. And there has been some land-related and housing-related protests in China, but they're kind of pockets of protests scattered around the countries. Has never really come together, become a housing movement or a land movement, right? And so the empirical question that the book poses is that, so how is the Chinese state able to engineer massive urban transformation in such a short time frame with minimum resistance? And this goes together with the theoretical puzzle. So the book proposes the solution that the state could outsource repression to two types of non-state actors. So these are the violent thugs and the non-violent brokers. And with that, it could augment everyday state power. But the two types of non-state actors are as portrayed on the book cover, which is these are anonymous individuals. these are any Zhangshan Li Si on Chinese street that you can pull and hire them or mobilize them to do the state's bidding. They are not particularly well known or well skilled in terms of these violent thugs. These are typically unemployed people who are willing to sell their muscle for a profit, so they get mobilized and put together as a group to conduct a state project and get paid either a daily wage or a project wage. But they are not particularly violent or particularly well trained and doesn't usually wield any weapon. And these non-violent brokers are also anonymous individuals. These are individuals, usually the elderly who are embedded within communities. And these are brokers who are trusted by the communities. So these are individuals, which is how it helps the state to conduct everyday repression. So in terms, you can think about it as kind of the two type of non-state actors which help to exercise everyday repression and mobilizing the masses respectively in order to augment everyday state power. So in terms of graphically, you can imagine that we typically think about a country as being divided into state and society, right? And there's a dividing line between state and society. But imagine if you could have individuals who are within the society. I'm not sure if this is working though. So if you could have individuals who are sitting in between the border between state and society. I think the room is small enough. Oh, I see. Okay. So if you could have individuals who sit in between the state and society. So in this case, these are the thugs. They are then hired by the state to repress society, right? And in terms of mobilizing the masses, you could have brokers who are also in between state and society. And these brokers, because they have got social capital, they could help to mobilize society that way. So in a way, if you think about it, instead of the state directly repressing or trying to convince these people to follow state policies, they only need to mobilize people who sit in between state and society. It's a cost-saving mechanism, really, to conduct repression as well as to implement policies. And with that, you can, the book, as an extension of outsourcing repression, the book then invites readers, which is you, to reimagine the contours of state power, because it is then able to extend its hands into society and reach society that it wasn't able to reach before. So in a way, I think the book tries to prompt readers to think about how we typically conceive repression, which is typically conducted by state actors, uniformed actors who are directly reporting or directly paid by the state. But the very nature of non-state actors suggests that the way that we think about repression, I think is in need of a reimagination. And if we kind of redefine what state repression is with the deployment of non-state actors, we also need to reimagine the contours of state power, because the state is now able to do a lot more than it did before, right? And I think with that, so I introduced persuasion as part of the mass mobilization in second part of the book. It, I think, constitutes a new tool in the authoritarian control toolkit, right? In addition to typical types of authoritarian control. And I'm quite happy to talk about that further. So let me talk a little bit about empirical strategy. Three types really. So first thing is I looked at ethnographic, so I carried out ethnographic research from 2011 to 2019 that was done annually. And secondly, I have a team of students which help to put together event data set. And this is not your typical kind of protest event data set. This is a data set about state actions. So when the state sends someone, ranging from the police, chengguan, government officials, thugs, to conduct housing demolition and to grab land, what are the responses from the citizens? Do they then go out to protest? Do they try to take the government to court? Do they stab themselves? Do they try to stab the officers, and so on? And that data set covers from the 90s to the late 2010s. We also, trying to do some content analysis of policy documents. So I looked at policy documents issued by the central government, by Shanghai, Chengdu, and Zhengzhou municipality government, which the three cities which I've spent the most time in, and looked at the government policy documents with respect to land taking and housing demolition. So if you like, strategy number 3 articulates the intention of the government. So this is how the government tells its local officials, local demolition officers, how demolition should be conducted. But given the intention, things might not go the way that the government has intended. So strategy number 1 and number 2 then gives you kind of the outcome of the event. So they really kind of complement each other. So from the content analysis, and I have some tables to show you a little bit later, you could see that quite clearly from the central as well as various levels of local government. They have intended demolition and housing and demolition as well as land grab to become less violent over time. So they will be urging local officials to use less violence and use more persuasion, thought work, and more carrots instead of sticks. And you could see that temporal variation over time. But as the original event data set and ethnography also echo that sort of intention, but to varying extent. This is a map of where I conducted my field research. So the different shades tell you how many times I have been there. So back in 2011, when I started the project, I started in Hefei. Because I had some connections with Hefei caste people. And then later on, I went to Beijing, Chengdu, which I spent a lot of time in, and Kunming, Zhengzhou. And then later on, as time moved on in the second part of the 2010s, I spent more time in Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, and Guangzhou. So even though I've been to kind of 8 different sites, sometimes I have not been able to collect sufficient data to put together a case studies, but I have got quotations kind of sprinkled throughout the book. But I've got detailed case study from Chengdu, from Kunming, from Zhengzhou, and from Tianjin. So kind of in terms of thinking about it in schematic terms, outsourcing repression is really a 2-step process. The first step is about the state going out to marshal a small group of society to become proxies. So once you marshal a group of society to become proxies, the proxies could help you then repress or mobilize the masses, right? So it's a 2-step process. So the scope condition is that the proxies must be complicit to state actions. So whatever the state does, they are actually doing their bidding, either wittingly or unwittingly, right? So if that condition is then met, then state power could then be augmented with the participation of a small group of society. Then with that, the acquiescence of a larger society, and on certain occasions, you could then legitimate state power, particularly in non-violent cases. So let me talk a little bit about kind of the nature of thugs for hire. So the way to think about it is, since I'm in New York City and, this is about Ukraine war and Wagner Group, the nature of it is actually not that much different from Putin hiring or mobilizing the Wagner group to help to fight a war in Ukraine. Having said that, the difference here between what I would call thugs for hire and a very violent group like the Wagner group is their capacity for violence. So the thugs for hire, they are ruffians, they are hooligans, they are hoodlums, they are street gangsters or legalized professionals sometimes who render violence as a for-profit service. So in Chinese, they are typically called 小混混. These are street gangsters, right? Like tattooed, well-built individual. Typically the unemployed or people who go out there just to make trouble for a living because they don't have the skill to get a well-paid job somewhere else. And they are quite distinct from mafias, the Japanese yakuza, the Russian violent entrepreneurs that criminal sociologists, criminologists write about. And I've read quite a bit of this literature. It is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. But I think in China, because of the capacity, because of the strength of the Chinese Communist Party, you see some of these thugs for hire going on, but nowhere are they as powerful as the Italian mafias or the Japanese yakuza. For one thing, they are not well organized. So I'm not saying that there is no mafias in China. That is not true. I think since the 90s, with the weakening of local state, particularly its weakening fiscal capacity, a lot of local governments, as I've shown in my case studies, have had to depend on these local gangsters to do everyday policies, such as collecting taxes and so on. And over time, they have given them actually more and more power because of state reliance on them. So they have actually grown over time. In some places, local areas, you actually have development of gangsters. So much so that, when Xi Jinping first came to power about 10 years ago, he launched a very famous anti-corruption policy campaign, which everyone knows about, right? But at the same time, there's also a 扫黑除恶, a sweeping black campaign, which is lesser known, but equally significant. And one of the targets, so the policy document listed 10 target groups. And one of the target groups are the gangsters who collude with local governments, who colluded with real estate developers to grab land and to demolish houses. They are explicitly singled out as a group in the central government policy documents, right? So if I could kind of put it in a kind of a X and Y axis, you can imagine, the type of violence or force being divided into private force and public force, and the capacity of violence on the Y axis. The thugs for hire fall into this category, in this quadrant, which is they use private force, right? Like the mafias, and unlike the militaries and the police, they use private force. But the capacity for violence are actually much lower compared to the military and compared to other type of violent groups. So what are the benefits and costs of everyday repression? What are the utilities of outsourcing violence? The benefits are, because these thugs for hire, they are perpetrators of illegal or illegitimate acts. They are hired to meet local governments' unfunded mandates, and their non-state identity, which then offers pretense of plausible deniability. In terms of cost, they are agency costs, meaning that the agent may not do what the principal tell them to do. The agents, which are these thugs, they may use excessive violence, either intentionally or unintentionally, and end up hurting people, and end up sometimes on some occasions killing people, even though the people who hired them did not ask them to kill people. When agency problems occur, accountability issue usually ensue. So there are cases when local officials get into trouble, get fired, get demoted, get sacked from the party when they use excessive violence, when they hire a lot of gangsters to do housing demolition, and they got out of control because they had to do it very quickly, and they would use any sort of force and end up killing people. and there's a huge social media expose about it, and invite backlash and get government into trouble. So I covered that in my case studies. And you can also imagine that in places where once you use this sort of outsourced violence for a long time, over 10 years, 20 years, especially since the mid-90s with the weakening of local state capacity, there's an over-reliance on them, an over-dependence relationship, and that actually risks usurping state authorities. So you go to some villages. I went to some villages in Sichuan, several of them, and some in Henan. The villagers will call these gangsters kind of Dier Zhengfu, the second government, because the formal level of government have lost a lot of legitimacy, have actually no legitimacy at all, because number one, they don't really have the fiscal resources to provide public goods and services. If they don't provide public goods and services, why should the citizens follow their state policies or respect the government, right? And so when businesses need protection, they would actually go to the gangsters instead of the government. And when the government needs to collect taxes and implement policy, they can't do it directly. They would then have to go to the gangsters. So it becomes a vicious cycle type of situation. So, and who are these brokers? These brokers are people who help to connect state and society. Because, without these brokers, you would imagine that there's actually a very high cost of mobilizing every member of society. So with brokers acting in between them, a broker could then help a state to connect with the masses. And the book trying to conceptually categorize these brokers into three different types. One is political brokers, whose position came from political appointment, right? So these are the neighborhood committees, these are the rural village committees, and urban communities. They are appointed by township government, they are appointed by higher level government. So their power comes from state authority. You also have social brokers, which the book then focuses on, whose power comes from social capital they command. So these people have no state appointment. Typically, the elderly who have lived in the community for a long time, they know people respect them, because of, they are like neighbors to people they are trying to convince. So this concept is actually not new. If you read, Liz Perry's and others' work, who write about what happened during the Cultural Revolution or Maoist years. So she wrote about volunteers and activists, the 积极分子. The natures are actually very, very similar, right? But these people have no power, has no political appointments. The book also has a case study from Shanghai that looks at economic brokers that work in housing demolition. So economic brokers, these are kind of profit-seeking intermediaries. Their power comes from the capacity to reduce information asymmetry between the client, who are people who want more compensation, and the state, and help to match the supply and demand. And the way to think about it is, for instance, in Shanghai, during zero COVID lockdown, at the end of it, there was excess death, a lot of death. Some families couldn't get access to a coffin. They would actually need to pay these brokers in order to secure a place in local cemetery or secure a coffin. And in Shanghai, it's called Huangniu. So the nature of it is very similar in how it works in urbanization. You can think about this as what we would call ticket scalpers in our society. So if you want to go see a concert, right, you couldn't get tickets beforehand. But if you go to the venue, or you can go online these days and pay double or triple the prices, these brokers would then help you to get tickets. But how do they get tickets? They get tickets because they have got backdoor channel to the ticket office. So this Huang Niu in urbanization works exactly the same. These are essentially corrupt transactions. These brokers have got connection with people in the demolition office. Either they are friends or relatives with people who work in the demolition office, could get a better deal. So they would work with clients and say that if you work with me, I could help you to secure an extra apartment and X amount of money, right? And once that deal is done, they would then split the extra 50%. So 50% of it would go to the client, and 50% would be shared among the demolition officers and the brokers. And in the process of doing so, these economic brokers, they help to provide actually a suite of services. They could provide a fake marriage certificate. They could provide a fake divorce certificate. They could actually provide a fake birth certificate, because with this sort of entitlement and an extra hukou in the family, they could help to secure better entitlement. So in a way, everyone gets a cut. Everyone who is involved gets a cut. So no one has an incentive to become a whistleblower. So we typically think about, state and society, but I think what the book tries to argue is that if you kind of pull these two layers apart, you can actually squeeze out this middle layer of brokerage, who are political brokers, economic brokers, and social brokers. And these are the brokers that help to connect state and society, which I would argue explains why the Chinese state is so powerful. So you think about it as an octopus. Why is an octopus so powerful? Because of its tentacles. So these brokers act like the tentacles that help the state to reach society and to penetrate society and to grip society. Without the tentacles, it will be a lot more difficult to do so. So this shows you the different types of agent, how many times they are present in the data set. So the most frequently hired ones are government officials, followed by the police, and then the thugs. So they are frequently deployed. You have various type of government officials which are less frequently deployed. And these are violent incidents. The number of times they are present in violent incidents. So the thugs are the third most frequently deployed agents. And this looks at the marginal effects of agent types on non-violent citizen responses. So given the different type of agents, so when different type of agents were present in the circumstances, what are the non-violent response of citizens? And the non-violent response are protest, petition, and legal mobilization. So if you look at the marginal effects of thugs, which is the first bar here, it is 0 or marginally negative compared to other types of state agents, which are usually positive, more positive than thugs. So the second bar is the police, third bar is quasi-security, which is Chengguan, and then government officials and grassroots government officials. So the marginal effects for thugs is usually 0 or negative. This tells you a similar story, but this is about violent citizen responses. So when agents get sent to demolish houses, oftentimes citizens get very emotional and get very, very defensive. They would damage their own properties. They might pull out a kitchen knife and then trying to stab agents, harming agents. Or they might actually pour kerosene onto themselves and try to kill themselves and set themselves on fire. So the self-harm is actually, the frequency is not very high, but such cases would often attract a lot of attention. back in 2011, there was a big case of self-harm, of self-immolation in Chengdu, got so much attention that it was actually covered in the New York Times. And after that, there was actually change of government policy that that discourages the use of violence. And if you look at the effects on violence, the thugs is marginally positive, negative here, 0 here, compared to positive marginal effects for other types of agents, right? So I think this statistical analysis, if you like, they gives you an idea of what happened when thugs is deployed on an average basis. But there are, of course, anomalies. I'm not saying that, thugs, when thugs are hired to do violent acts, they are always successful, backlash never occurs. So the data set is then complemented by my ethnographic study. And the way that I select my cases in ethnography, I think in methodological terms is the way that I selected, because I looked at media reports where huge protests have happened 6 months, a year ago, because of land grab, because of housing demolition. Then, I decided to go there to take a visit during the summer. So I work backwards. So in a way, these are failed government outsourcing violence cases, and therefore huge protests occur, which then allows me to look at why cases fail, because I actually selecting them based on fail outcome, right? So I did that for several case studies, and you can imagine that in those failed cases, they are typically agency problems, excessive violence were used, either willingly, intentionally or unintentionally, and that denies the benefit of plausible deniability and evasion of accountability. And in the case of Kunming, I then show that how outsourcing violence then usurps state capacity, and the consequence is there's punishment of local leaders. So this is the case in Shanghai, in Xuhui district. So I came across this when I was at the conference in, I think, 2016 or 17, just before the pandemic. I was with a group of people. I came across this empty plot of land, and half demolished house in Xuhui, which is, the next street is actually Huaihai Zhonglu, which is where the shopping street is in Shanghai. So I was wondering, why is this empty plot of land sitting in such an expensive area? And I asked around and found some journalists who wrote about it, and they introduced me through some connections to talk to a guy who used to live here. And so what happened is, back in 2005, real estate companies in collusion with the local government trying to evict people in the middle of the night by setting fire to this plot of land. And everyone has managed to escape, that is in the middle of the night, except an elderly couple. So that became, that was exposed in the media, and that being Shanghai. And even though in the 2000s, until now, they have not been able to complete the project, and the land is still sitting there undeveloped. So in the left-hand side, right-hand side, and four corners of these half demolished houses are actually empty land, and it's cordoned off. The whole place is cordoned off. But you can see the back of it are tall buildings, high-rise buildings in Shanghai. And in this case, there's arson, there's violent demolition, which led to the failed outcome. And until today, some people are still trying to go to petition, trying to go to the Central Petition Bureau every year to get justice. The second case looked at also violent land grab and housing demolition in Kunming. This is a Chengzhongchun. So this is a village in the city, in the outskirts of the city. So usually with Chengzhongchun, with village in the cities, the demolition is actually more violent compared to rural areas. The reason is land in this area, land in the Chengdongchuan, in the outskirts of the city, is actually very, very pricey. Because as the city expands, demand for land become higher. But these people are also wealthy people, relatively wealthy. So they are not willing to just let go of their housing. So what happened is that 2 years ago, they were forced to give up their farmland and then move to this new village. So they empty out their savings and borrow some money from banks to build 4-story shop houses. So they would run retail business at the bottom on ground level and live on the second floor and then rent out 3rd and 4th floor to migrant workers. So they've got steady income from retail business. They've got steady income from migrant workers. But this is typically kind of the profile and the demographics of Chengdongchuan. And when you want to demolish these houses, and their livelihood depends on these houses, and most of them would have taken out loans or empty out their savings to build these houses. And if you give them inadequate compensation, they would fight with the government with their lives, which is why most of these cases are very violent. So this is a case in the outskirts of Kunming. You can see a bunch of elderly women sitting in front of the crane using themselves as a shield. Because in Chinese society, it'd be very disrespectful to hurt the elderly. So it's a frequent strategy by protesters to shield themselves from demolition. This is another case from Zhengzhou. So I went to a bunch of villages, Chengdongchuan, in the outskirts of Zhengzhou in the mid-2010s. And the nature of Chengdongchuan is also very similar to that in Kunming, but in Zhengzhou, it was carried out to a massive extent. And there was a lot of violence and use in the process. So the picture shows you that, today the government would put up a red banner saying that, it's good to expand, it's good to develop spaces, and because it helps to improve people's environment. And the next day, these protesters would come with a white banners, so with a banner war, and say that, don't try to cheat us. You are disobeying the rules and things like that. So this was played out over a couple of years, and on a massive scale in Zhengzhou. So Zhengzhou, over the last 15 years or so, developed very, very quickly. A lot of places got kind of urbanized, but with massive cost to human development. And this is how, how brokerage works. If you think about it, kind of political brokers, these are straight lines because their power comes from direct political appointment, whereas social brokers is a type of mobilization, and hence is kind of dotted line that is mobilized by people whose power come from the social capital that they have accumulated over the years. And economic brokers is a double-sided arrow because this is how there's negotiation and bargaining between the state and society facilitated by the economic brokers. So if you think about it, how zero COVID policies were implemented, a lot of that was done by neighborhood committees who are the political brokers, right? They are appointed by the state, and some of them are from local communities, but others are actually not from local communities. Those who are from local communities know the communities. They would be closer to the citizens, and therefore usually get higher compliance. But zero COVID was hugely successful in the first 2.5 years because they were able to deploy the volunteers and the enthusiasts who I would call social brokers to take temperatures, to convince people to do thought work without resorting to the use of violence. So this shows you from my data set, when different sort of non-violent strategies is used, such as collective punishment, like 连坐, right? So if one family refused to obey, you punish the entire community. Welfare suspension, thought work, which is 做思想工作, and financial rewards, which are carrots. When different types of non-violent strategies is deployed, to what extent do you get compliance and to what extent do you get resistance? And you can see here that the success rate, the compliance rate for thought work is actually very high, close to 80%, and it's actually higher than financial reward. Is actually higher than carrots is deployed. So chapter 6 then talks about how thought work is done by these social brokers. I looked at the self-governed renovation committee 自改委 in Chengdu, mediation and people's mediation in Shanghai, and the case of economic brokers or Huangniu in Shanghai. So how this 自改委 works is, this self-governed renovation is, so when a community wants to undergo demolition, right? So it used to be the case that the state, the government needs to send people to convince everybody to sign papers. And that is very costly for the government. But what they do is they help to form a committee. So the community come together to form a committee. And the self-governed renovation committee, which sounds very democratic, is usually led by people who are social brokers, right? Who are social brokers who could then convince people to obey state policies. And they are given early bird bonuses. So when they sign up first, when they sign their name away first, they were given a few $1,000s for that. And with that, every family that they convince to sign papers, they'll be given extra bonus. So there's actually a lot of financial incentive involved. And they'll use all sorts of strategies to help to convince people, including harassment, thought work, blah, blah, blah. So chapter 7 then trying to kind of to put China's findings in the context of other countries. So I compared it to South Korea pre and post 87, pre and post democratization. I think pre-democratization South Korea is actually very, very similar to contemporary China. Because at that time, the government wanted to clear slums in Seoul to make space for Asian Games. They hired a lot of gangsters to do the job very violently. But post 87, they actually did not do away with outsourcing violence. Instead, they hired private security companies to do so. But these private security companies, they also hired gangsters. But these gangsters, put on uniform, looks more, proper, looks more 斯文, but they actually, the same sort of people. So if that is the case, that what happened in South Korea, you could imagine that would probably become the future in China, right? In India, which I think presents most dissimilar case studies. So I did some work in India, looked at how slums and how violence were used. There are a lot of intermediaries in India, but unlike those in China, those intermediaries are actually quite powerful. So the gangsters run or rule colonies, urban colonies, which are slums in the cities. And because the local politicians depend on these violent gangsters to collect votes and to present them with vote banks during elections, to some extent, the local politicians are then held hostage by these violent gangsters, right? So brokers have a lot of power, could then bargain, have leverage over the state. But in China, it's the other way around. The state has a lot of control over the intermediaries. The intermediaries became proxies of the state in implementing policies. So one is most similar and the other one is dissimilar cases. And I also look at Russia during Yeltsin's years, which is weaker state capacity, and then Putin's years, which recovered some of their state capacity. Concluding chapter, I looked at, outsourcing repression beyond urbanization in collection of rural taxes, in other sort of policies like one-child policy, its implementation, which was also very violent. I put it in the context of Xi Jinping's sweeping black campaign and draw implications for China's political future. I also speculate about, the future of field research in China. I consider myself, very lucky to be able to spend so much time in the field when it was still possible to do so. But I think quite sadly that era has come to an end. And for external validity, so since the book's publication, I have written some articles. Most recent one published in Journal of Democracies look at how the same set of arguments and logic could be applied to zero COVID policy. So you get zero COVID policies was implemented for about 3 years. Huge compliance in the first 2.5 years. You get a lot of resistance, which led to white paper protests in the last 6 months. First 2.5 years, they used social brokers, political brokers, nonviolent strategies, which lead to huge compliance. Last 6 months, virus got out of control, but the government, Xi Jinping, still stubbornly wanted to implement zero COVID. So they had to hire people from the street. Anyone who is unemployed got laid off from Foxconn, got laid off from factories. People do not comply. They started using violence randomly, right? So the sequence is actually opposite from urbanization. In urbanization, I observe violent strategies at the beginning and non-violent towards the end of my study, whereas in zero COVID, the sequence is switched first with non-violent and later on with violence, which ultimately resulted in huge resistance and the white paper protests. I think this is the last slide, so I'll leave it here. Thank you so much.
Well, why don't we just open it up for questions? Then you get to figure your own questions.
Sure. Let me just grab my. Yes. Question. Andy?
I have a question about plausible deniability. How is it that the plausible deniability, how is it that the victims don't connect these thugs to the officials or to the officials or to the developers? I guess they say the developer sent me, or how does that work?
Sure.
But you can't get away with that and the officials not know about it or something.
Sure.
Yeah.
So the way plausible deniability works is at the 2 levels. Whether or not, when you get beaten up, whether you know that these people were actually sent by somebody. That's first level. The second level is, even if you know that the mastermind behind is someone connected to the government, even though that the person who hired them are ultimately connected to the government, you can't actually bring evidence that could actually bring them to account, right? Because these are people who do not wear uniform, they leave no traces of evidence. Things are usually done in the middle of the night, away from the public gaze. Quite different from the Yunlong incident in Hong Kong several years ago, when that sort of pro-Beijing forces hiring gangsters to beat people up using a lot of violence at 7 p.m. Peak traffic hours. In China, is usually done at 2 a.m. in the morning in the dark alley. So you know that this is connected. This is because the other day someone came and visited you and you said no to the government, and then they harass you in the middle of the night. But even if you know that, you cannot actually bring accountability to that sort of action. That is where plausible deniability then steps in. It's at the second level. Yes.
Thanks for speaking to us. Can you talk to what the data says for, thank you, Can you speak to over the next like 5-10 years, looking at the data so far, what does it say about the trend in usage of the thug activity by state actors, and two, like the violent or non-violent actions taken by the thugs?
Sure. So the temporal variation is there's less and less violence over time, right? Because the cost of using violence is getting higher. At the beginning, like the 90s, early 2000s, especially the 90s, social media, Weibo, which is the equivalent of Twitter or X, wasn't that prevalent. So people could use violence and then get away. When cell phone becomes very common, and then people could just snap a video and upload it to Weibo, that's when the cost of using violence get higher and higher. So over time, I could see a decline in use of violence, and the use of non-violent strategies such as thought work then increase over time. Yeah.
Is the number of thugs also going to go down, you think? Is that the implication?
The number of thugs, not necessarily in absolute terms, but the number of frequency would actually go down, right? So I don't have the statistics for the number of thugs. I have the statistics for the event, right? Just to be clear, right?
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
When you're speaking, make sure you use the mic so that the people can hear you.
Thanks for coming. Can you speak about how this model of outsourced oppression has been, or is or is not used by the CCP abroad, either to subject Chinese nationals outside of China to repression, or things like IP theft, and kind of more like economic espionage? To what degree is it state run? To what degree are they bringing on contractors?
Right. So I do my research and I think about things in my research term. So when I think about how transnational repression is conducted by the CCP through civil society organizations such as United Front Work, which is an arm of the Chinese Communist Party, and under it there's tons of civil society organizations, and such as hometown associations. So about 6 months ago, there was a huge media expose about an illegal police station in Flushing, right? And that was run by hometown association from some Changle, from a town, from a city in Fujian, in Fuzhou. And it's part of the United Front group. So I would say that actually could be classified as a type of outsourcing repression, that the state do not repress people, these fugitives, directly. They work through civil society organization. But the difference is they are in a different legal jurisdiction. So the extent to which they can actually control the agent is very different from in domestic China, where they have more direct control. Whereas in the United States, they couldn't, and they are subject to a different legal jurisdiction. So the effectiveness of outsourcing repression, when the CCP is doing it in the foreign land, is so much less effective when it's done domestically. I would say that is the difference to me.
Many of the tactics that you have described are unfortunately tactics that have been used in different contexts in the United States. I could even talk about, the battles that have gone on as Columbia University has expanded. In fact, you may wonder, what is this old guy doing here? This old guy is here because he's allowed to audit one class per semester at Columbia free of charge. It's a wonderful benefit. I have that benefit because when Columbia was fighting with the neighbors about its expansion, that was one of the concessions that was offered. And we go through this. And when we talk about race in the United States, we can go back and, where criminal was used. Are there no laws in China that when you're doing major land development, here it's called urban renewal,
cynics say it really means black removal, depending upon your perspective. But are there no mechanisms where, as a matter of policy, someone announces that this area is going to be redeveloped with better quality housing and there's going to be relocation?
Yeah. So there are rules and regulation. So all the land in China, in urban China, are state-owned land, right? And rural land are collectively owned. And so the rules regulating the relocation of people and demolition of houses on state-owned land underwent a major reform in 2011. That was the case that I talked about. Before 2011, huge violence, a lot of violence on demolition of housing on state-owned land. Self-immolation was very common because people put everything into this house and they still owe banks money, right? When you want to violently take it down with very little compensation, people will fight their lives with you. So 2011, that a woman called Tang Fuzhen in Chengdu, she went to the rooftop and poured kerosene onto herself, set herself on fire with hundreds of onlookers, including journalists. That hurts the reputation of the Chengdu government very, very much. So after that, they tried to come up with kind of policy innovation that is more palatable to society on the one hand, and allow development and urbanization to carry on the other hand, to balance between the two. And that led to eventually a change in central government regulation, which is, it used to be the case that real estate companies can just do demolition, right? And real estate companies, there's no accountability. So more violent before 2011. After 2011, only government entities could conduct demolition. So you see this decline. So in my book, I have this graph that shows a decline in violent cases after the regulation is introduced. But it's all in relative terms, right? Less violent doesn't mean that there's no violence, but there is that. The law also says that you need to consult people. And the consensus is you need to have 99% consensus. So it's not just getting a signature from the head of the household. So it's not getting a signature from the father of each family. You actually need to get signature from each and every individual adult in the family. That is when the thought work, 思想工作 comes in. Because it's not just a matter of convincing the father. You could have a family of 4. Father is convinced, mother is not convinced, brother is convinced, sister is not convinced. You need to send in brokers to talk to people who are not convinced. And sometimes people do not sign, not because they disagree with the government, because they disagree among the family members. They don't agree with compensation and have family infighting. So they need to go into immediate family disputes. Only after mediating family disputes, you get compliance to state policies. And who could do this sort of mediation of family disputes? Only brokers who know the families very well.
Do you see a tension in the Chinese value of we're looking for 100% consensus, the needs of a society to develop and adjust to changes in the economy, and that if we pretend we must get 100% consensus, then doesn't that itself almost encourage the type of tactics, strategies that you've described?
Yeah, sure. So, for those of us here who study China would know that this is actually a government, ironically, that cares about its legitimacy a great deal, even though it's an authoritarian state. It cares about having the facade of legitimacy, having the facade of democratic consultation. And because urbanization was carried out very rapidly, became the #1 source of social unrest for a good, I would say, nearly 20 years, since late 90s to the 2000s. The government pays a lot of attention trying to build the facade. And having this democratic consultation, 99% consensus, less violence use, more thought work, it's a reflection of their effort in order to gain societal trust to their policies, right? I mean, the era of huge development, huge urbanization has come to an end in China with the, declining contribution of real estate to GDP growth. But during its heyday, it was the number one source of social instability because of protests, because of violence. And the government did actually try very hard to try to save, to salvage its legitimacy, given the cost of it. Yes.
Thanks so much for a very interesting topic and the project. I have two questions, and my apologies in advance if I misunderstand you because I came here 10 minutes later. And the first question is, I noticed on the one hand, you argue these intermediaries are like technicals of the octopus. So the Chinese government can increase its control over the society. But on the other hand, this phenomena arose in the 1990s when the local government financial capacity was the weakest, or when they were weak. Then, so how to reconciliate? On the one hand, you argue this increases the state capacity. On the other hand, you said this phenomena arose exactly because the state capacity was weak. And a second question is also related to the first one. Usually, we think the process of modern state building is we transform from the indirect rule to direct rule. We want to get rid of those brokers, and we usually think those brokers are exactly the sign of weak state capacity and the limited range of state control. But here, your very interesting talk argues no, this brokers can strengthen the state capacity. Then my question is, what's the difference between today's brokers and the medieval brokers? And what's the future trend? Are we going back to the new medieval age? Thank you.
So I think the relationship between outsourcing violence and state capacity is actually not very straightforward. So you can think about it as physically, local governments was in declining state capacity after fiscal re-centralization policies in 1994, when the central government in sequential steps re-centralized various revenue from local government back to the central government. That took place in 1994 with this tax contracting system, right? So various local level of government, particularly the lower level that you go, the more incapacitated their abilities were in terms of fiscal resources. So they could not use formal mechanisms or formal agents to get the same work done. They still have mandates. So what they had to do in order to meet their mandates is to use informal mechanisms, such as thugs for hire, right? And they use thugs for hire, they could pay them directly, or they could trade. So in that village in Kunming, what I observed is there was a lot of reliance on gangsters to get things done on an everyday basis, but they do not pay them directly. There was actually very vibrant night market going on in the village, and they allow those gangsters to come in to collect protection fees from the night market vendors. So that's how they make money. So the government do not need to pay these gangsters directly, but allowing these people to collect protection fees is a way of allowing them to run their own business legally in that sense. But if you look at kind of the general political science literature, people who look at why countries would use militia, would use paramilitary to fight a war and things like that, I think the relationship with state capacity is not exactly clear-cut either.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating. My question was, so my impression from your talk was case studies were separately done to examine the role of brokers and thugs. I was wondering if they interact or overlap in the same case study. So for example, one is engaging in thought work, or, and then kind of going to these community service to learn and being persuaded, but on the same day and at 2 a.m. on the street, you get smacked by thugs. Like, I wonder how these things work and then who's making the decision about when to use social workers and thugs at the same time.
That is a very interesting question. And I must say that, when I went to the field, I don't have a kind of a grand strategy or grand plan in mind, right? It was kind of doing things bit by bit, kind of feeling the stones by crossing the river type of research approach. So I went in just to look at gangsters because everyone was telling me about gangsters and thugs, and I did not have brokers in my mind. But then as I worked myself from the inland to the cities, I kept looking for thugs, and there were none. But urbanization still get done. So I told myself, there's no thugs. Someone else must be involved. And hence, second part of the book was about brokers. And I can tell you honestly, the other big reason why I decided to look at brokers is because I did not want to write a book just about thugs in China for very practical reason. I mean, I could have, but I think I have another 25 years of my China career left, and I do not want to write a book about thugs, right? So I have to say something positive about the Chinese government, and hence the second part of the book. So I have not come across a case where I observe how these two switch, but I can think about kind of logically how they would do. And this has to do with kind of the cost of violence. This has to do with location and whether it's rural or inland. So it has to do with geography and the citizens that they're trying to target and cost and benefit type of analysis. Yeah. Yes, so you have been very patient, so.
Thank you so much for this talk. Super interesting. I also had a question a little bit more about both the violent and nonviolent intermediaries and a little bit around their incentives and also their longevity. If you got a sense from your casework around, whether this seems to be like a viable career, is it more like a short part-time job that happens when the land grab is taking place, and then once it's urbanized, there's nothing left to do. They then, divert to other issues like the one-child policy. So that's kind of one thing just around the temporal nature. And the second question was, it does seem like there's a lot of financial incentives or financial benefits to partaking, whether it is, actually getting paid by the government or the other examples you raised around, funds you can get from participating in these activities. Would you say that it is primarily economically driven? Who are the volunteers and enthusiasts, and kind of how we can think about those motives?
Right. Yeah, that's a really important question. So these thugs, they are not career thugs, right? These are unemployed. They get involved on a project basis. And the typical urbanization land grab or demolition project is about 9 months, 9 months to 12 months. So they're hired for that period of time. They get paid. Sometimes, the head of the gangsters might get paid for apartment. I've been to the field. They said, these apartments belongs to the gangsters that help demolish the houses, right? But they are not a career as such, and they are motivated by financial rewards, very straightforward type of financial rewards. The brokers are a little bit more complicated. So usually the social brokers are motivated by normative beliefs. They believe in what the state does. They believe that they are actually doing the community a favor by convincing them to comply with state policies, because they would go in there and say that, if you don't sign the papers, think about your neighbors. They have young family members who need to move on with their lives, and they need to get this apartment in order to carry on with their lives. So you're actually holding everyone up by your recalcitrant behavior. It's often kind of framed and couched in those terms. So those people, I think a lot of them genuinely believes in doing good deeds on behalf of the party, in working with the community. They would say that I'm going there to help the party get rid of nails, to get rid of nail households, But in terms of housing demolition, because the stake is so high, aside from normative belief, they also have financial rewards, right? You give them early birds bonuses and then extra bonuses when they get things done. But in terms of zero COVID, most of it is actually normative beliefs. People generally bought into how successful zero COVID was, and the CCP was able to save lives, and they could point to, U.S. government under Trump that had a million deaths within 9 months, right? So that sort of contrast and government narrative really helps to boost people's confidence, at least at the beginning. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm very curious about which level of government will use such a rough, informal, violent ways to execute their urbanization plan. And I guess upper government or even central government are not willing to see the local government to execute their policy in this way. So it would be executed in without supervised by the upper government. So even the county government or even the grassroots government such as 街道办 to do that. And another question is about how they can and they want to use informal violent power to execute their plan in individual way or organizational way, which means it's several government officials contact with the political broker to do that, or it's a organized group decision to do that. And that's my question. Thank you.
Okay, so if it's a land grab case, the decision is usually made by township government, right? Township government. And village authorities will have to help out with township government. So if there's kind of use of thugs and things like that, is carried out by village authorities directly, but with the blessing of township government. So their superiors really know about it and decide not to pay attention to that. If it's housing demolition in the municipality, let's say demolishing Chengdongchun in Kunming, in Zhengzhou, is actually done directly by municipal government, but implemented by urban communities, implemented by Sequ. But the order is given by municipality. So when in Kunming, when Chu He got into trouble, I think Chu He was actually the deputy mayor of the city. And in Zhengzhou, Wang Tianjun was the deputy party secretary at the time. So it goes to the very top leadership of the municipal level. And sometimes even the provincial level, even the actual implementation is done lower down. Because it's all cascaded down and you need the blessing from the very top. And the urgency of urbanization also comes from the very top.
So you got a question from Zoom, from Tenzin Dori. So are the thugs or brokers ever punished by the public for their actions? Are these cases where the victims have mobilized the public to identify the thugs or brokers and subject them to social ostracism or other types of social punishment? In other words, the benefits reaped by the thugs and brokers are clear, but what are the costs to them?
I would say the costs are not really directly borne by the thugs because they are only the agents. The costs when you have agency problem and excessive violence is used are borne by people who hired them, who are the local officials. So I gave the two examples of the mayor stroke party secretary Chu He in Kunming and Wang Tianjun in Zhengzhou. Both of them tried to develop and urbanize their respective cities, Kunming and Zhengzhou, very rapidly, particularly in Zhengzhou. This guy had a nickname called Yizimei. He would look at a map of Zhengzhou, point his finger at the village, and the next day the village would be gone, would be demolished. It was done at a rapid speed. Eventually, they were sacked by the party for corruption charges. But corruption is charged for all sorts of things, and the ultimate reason behind is because of excessive violence used in urbanization, which brought huge, tremendous cost to the government. And the cost is only not to the local government, but also higher up.
Thank you very much for talking to us. The question I had related to the presence of civil society in China. In reading about Soviet history, my understanding has been that Soviet authoritarianism sought to eliminate any private civil society, any civil society organizations that were not state sanctioned, because civil society and social capital that was outside the control of the autocracy represented, if not a current, then a potential future organized threat to the state's monopoly on governance, violence, legitimacy. What has the CCP done to at once employ social capital, extra state actors to enact policy without inadvertently creating organizations or networks or individuals or social capital that later threatens the state's monopoly on governments or violence?
Yeah, so really what you're asking is whether by hiring the thugs, they have helped inadvertently to create gangsterism, right?
Or the social brokers to create private civil relationships that one day bear the seeds of resistance to the state in a systematic way.
Yeah, but the Chinese Communist Party is also a party that is very, very non-receptive or allergic to any sort of civil society organization, right? So brokers have never really come together to form any sort of associations. So these are atomic individuals who are then mobilized by the state to do the state's bidding. And in terms of these violent thugs, most of them are private individuals too. They are atomic, that do not belong to a group. But I think since the late 90s and 2000s, in some areas, you also have the rise of gangsterism. These days, you could read even in mainstream Western media about gangsters, doing all sorts of things in China, despite Xi Jinping's effort to crack down on them. I think gangsterism is becoming a force and a problem in some areas, not everywhere, but in hard to reach areas where you get a lot of corruption with local governments, weakening state capacity. Gangsterism actually thrive. I don't have systematic data. I have some sense of where they exist. So typically they have been historically very vibrant in the Northeast. So this whole thing about violent land grab and housing demolition started in the Northeast and then went south in Guangdong area and then Western China. Less so in coastal cities. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the talk. I have two questions. The first one is related to the mechanism behind this. To me, it seems like there are different mechanisms behind the first one. The first one, especially initially, it looks like it's related to the lack of capacity, especially in the rural part of China, as you just described. In some villages, the state cannot directly interact or control the community, so they have to rely on the traditional authorities or all the gangsters there to either gather information or do some daily basis things. And in these circumstances, the rationale behind this is that the state is lack of capacity. But later in the modern cases, it seems like the state already has stronger capacity, but they just want to have such gangsters to help them do something, and they can attribute blames to them. And it's kind of related to there are two kinds of client agents problems here. The one you described is between the local government and the gangsters. And it's also related to another agency problems. That's the central government and local government. And I'm thinking perhaps the gangster, the whole phenomenon is it sense that the central government lack certain capacity to solve the agency problem of the local government, or they just deliberately tolerant and let it goes on, and when something bad happens, they can attribute the blame to either the local government or to the gangsters.
Right. Not so much that. Not so if you want to bring kind of central government into the picture, into the game, it's not so much that the central government wants the gangsters in order to take the blame, to be the scapegoats, no. But the central government, so but this is back at the when during Hu Jintao's years, so they wanted to promote urbanization explicitly as an engine of growth, right? But how do you do that rapidly while keeping a lid on social instability and keeping a lid on protests? And the local government, they have a lot of incentive to do so, because the more you take land and convert it into commercial housing, it boosts GDP growth, it stimulates GDP growth directly, and GDP growth would then contribute to career prospects, career promotion. So they have a lot of incentive to do so, but they cannot use their formal means and formal resources, formal agents to do that sort of job which is required by higher level. So what they do is they use an inconvenient mechanism, which is to hire thugs to do that more quickly, to evade responsibility, but also to take some of the blame. But taking blames is from the perspective of local government, not so much from the central government. The central government thinks about GDP growth, thinks about urbanization. Local governments think about all those things, in addition to that, thinking about the cost of demolition, the cost of taking land.
A follow-up question to Yinghui's question. So I want to ask about the division between the rural and the urban. So I think you talk about the 1994 tax reforms here, which is about the recentralization of the fiscal capacity. But another reform related, I think, would be the changes in the rural areas, which is the abolishment of the agricultural tax in 2003-2004, which after that the local government and in the villages becomes very, very weak, because they can no longer take tax from the peasants. So then my question is, does this policy change affect this kind of phenomenon in rural areas? Because my intuition is that urban government, local government tends to be richer. Yeah? So does it make it more likely for urban governments to hire thugs, or does it make it more likely for local rural governments or rural committees to hire thugs? I think it's also related to the previous question about fiscal capacities and this kind of phenomena. Thank you.
Sure. So I see the abolition of agricultural taxes in the early 2010 as a series of weakening fiscal local capacity, starting from 94, and that culminated in abolition of an agricultural tax. So this is all a part of that weakening state capacity. So my first book, Prosper or Perish, is actually looking at local fiscal capacity of local governments. My sense is that agricultural tax did not constitute a huge proportion of local authorities' fiscal basis. At least in those places that I have done my work, and I did my work in several provinces, including Sichuan. My sense is that when Hu Jintao came into power, he wanted to kind of build a good reputation for the central government, to bolster the legitimacy for the regime, particularly in the eyes of rural peasants. And abolition of agricultural tax and fees was a very low-hanging fruit. Very low-hanging fruits. It doesn't hurt fiscal coffers very, very much. And it has been century old, so it's very symbolic of the emperor coming in, to save the peasants. Material effect, my sense is, it has not very substantive. But you are right that it's part of this weakening of fiscal capacity. Yeah.
No, thanks, Lynette.
Thank you everyone for coming. And the book is available at all public
You'll find it
bookstores.
if we buy.
Yes.